Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
Doing okay, yeah.
Uh, we've been stuck at home for a while with COVID. Yay, the kids brought COVID home from school, so it's been a
Um,
rough little while, but we're
yeah,
hanging in there. At least it didn't affect them too badly.
good. That's good.
Oh, hi Jane, how are you doing?
Good. Sorry to hear about the COVID.
Yeah, it's been rough. Today was their first day back. So they're particularly energetic out there with my wife. So hopefully we don't hear a lot of screaming. They're like, I want to tell you all about my day. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'll talk in 2 hours. So might hear some screaming out there. But yeah, they haven't been in school for 2 weeks now, so they are rearing to go to talk about everything. But it's good. Yeah, it wasn't too bad. They just had fevers for 3 or 4 days or so. Nothing too crazy.
It's such a scary disease because there's so many unknowns.
I know. Yeah, is it going to come back whenever you start to? We were really worried about, it begins to go away, but does that mean it's going to come back? Does that mean this? Does that mean that? Yeah, but it's been okay. It's been okay. I wonder if anyone else is coming. I got an email from one poet who said she wasn't going to be able to join today, but I'm not sure about everyone else. So we'll see. Maybe it'll be like last week with her. There were 2 people last week, so I recorded it, of course. So hopefully everyone got that. But
I was listening last week, but I couldn't participate.
oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of funny. I wondered what it would be like to watch, to rewatch the recording when there are so few people. It kind of changes maybe the dynamics and gets
Right.
chit chatty.
And I actually may need to bow out. We have some stress going on here as well, and I may not make it through the whole, but I hope so.
Oh, okay, absolutely. That's totally understandable. Of course, it always is and always will be. Yeah. So how are both of you otherwise though? Is everything okay over there? Kind of, sort of.
Kind of, sort of.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh boy, it's yeah. It is one of those, yeah. One of those situations.
Right.
But did either of you do anything special over this past week? Anything that was in this day and age? It's like I feel like we're so it's so easy to focus on the negative, that I'm always wondering about the positive.
Yeah. No, nothing special.
Nothing too special. Okay.
No.
So did you what did we do? Yeah, nothing much. Is anyone else? Oh, hello. Oh, hey, hi, Arlene.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, it's been mixed today too. It's been wild trying to catch up with everything. I've been so behind after 2 weeks of kids being at home, and then pluses and minuses. Just within a few minutes got an email that I'd won a poetry award today, which is nice. And
Cool.
so that'll be cool. And it's been a little while, so since earlier in the year, so I was all excited about that. But then realized, and then we finished our the Inflectionist review, the new issue. Sent out the proofs and realized that none of the links were correct.
Oh.
So now I'm getting 30 to 40 emails, just boom, boom, boom. I can't seem to get the link from the table of contents going to the poem. For some reason, there's something going on there. I was like, oh no, I have no idea what's going on. It's weird.
I figured out how to do it though. If I clicked on my name, it wouldn't work, but if in the blurb that it gave me another place to click, and then that worked.
Yeah, I know in the blurb, yeah, because we generally have it set up, since some people have more than one poem in it. It's, the name doesn't click, but the poem title should. And it seems like some of them are going over. I'm getting emails from people like they're just pouring in like water. And some people are saying, oh, it looks good. And then other people are like, it's saying I can't connect. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to look at that until tomorrow. Now I feel embarrassed. Pluses and minuses. Hey, Paul.
Hello.
It's 3:03. I would definitely want to start, but as far as I know, there should be a few other people joining. So maybe 2 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Maybe we'll just kind of, or actually, well, we were going to start with, of course, sharing too. So, it's okay if someone who's coming in later is unable to share. So maybe we'll do. So maybe I should ask that instead. Would anyone? I did get to see three. I think I said only three poems this week in terms of critique. So I've only seen a few, but were any of you able to complete a poem that you might want to share? No, not so much. Okay. I know, Paul, I remember you had, obviously, most recently. Not that you have to, but did you want to share it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to share it.
Oh.
So here we go. I hope, let me know if you can't hear me because I'm trying a new microphone out. So if it's a problem, speak up. So this poem is titled Space Opera. 1. Almost anyone can learn to fly with only a few days of light training. Shatner began to explain the feeling of escaping Earth's atmosphere, but waited patiently while Bezos stopped him to grab a bottle of champagne. There is mother and earth and comfort, and there, Shatner gestured into the air. Is there death? Is that death? Is that the way death is? 2. Days merge into each other as time seems to blur and slow down. The skeletons move across a barren landscape toward the few people still living. Death takes a long time to fade. What we are living through now is a new cycle of collective dismay, Dr. Green said. 3. Deer, elk, moose, bears entangle in swing sets, hammocks, clotheslines, holiday lighting, chicken feeders, soccer goals, and volleyball nets. An elusive elk has been wandering the hills with a car tire around its neck for 2 years. Would you eat venison if it could slowly eat away at your brain? 4. Poses appeared showing humans who had been vaccinated sprouting horns and hooves. The bubonic egg remained smoldering. HIV is still with us. I'm Captain Kirk and I'm terrified. Shatner stood up. I'm not really terrified, he said, laughing. Yes, I am. It comes and goes like a summer cold.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly like what you'd mentioned before, that getting the inspiration from that particularly that interesting story. And although I'm not too on the news these days, but I ended up, after you had mentioned it, Paul, I had actually looked in on, I think it was YouTube, and watched his speech, if you want to call it that, his talk about it. Quite profound. It was deeply meaningful, I thought. And then, of course, Jeff Bezos just pops in and just interrupts a rather poetic and deeply moving, talk about humanity and our place and things with champagne. I was like, oh my goodness. And that helped because when I read your poem, I was like, oh yeah, I should watch that. I watched it. I was like, oh, that's so embarrassing. Who do you think you are? Yeah.
I had watched it. I got that from a story in the New Yorker. So I really liked it. To be honest, I thought I was going to write more of a satire of the whole thing. But once I started reading the story, it was more interesting than I expected.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to read a poem? You don't have to, but would anyone else, whether it's one you wrote this week or last week, but you just haven't shared it yet? Does anyone have a cento type poem? No? Okay. That's okay. I know. I really wanted to. I came up with one and I took some notes on it, but then of course, since my kids have been home for 2 weeks straight, I haven't been able to parse through it. But I did take some notes on one that I wanted to create myself this week. It just, life got in the way. Maybe I'll get that.
I have one I could read.
Oh, okay, excellent.
It's I had done sort of an erasure of an article, and then last week I I sort of collaged lines from a poem into it. And the original may be better than this one, but this is what I have. Refreshments will be served. All interested in the health of little children are invited. Body bags keep passing by. Automobiles will be furnished. They will leave Hotel Oakland at 12:45. White on the road, flying beneath your vehicle. Being in a coma can play havoc with your sense of time. A seat in machines may be reserved, tilted toward you know where. After an inspection of the unit, if you are to live in extra innings, you'll have to watch the corners. A dedication, the Aryan trio, dropping out of time, followed by an informal reception, refrigerated and put to sleep, dissolving your sense of time under the trees.
Oh, that was beautiful. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, I like that. You dissolving the sense of trees. Beautiful. What a beautiful ending. I know Arlene was shaking now, and Shelley, you're yeah. Some of these are tough ones too. Now, this next one for this week might be one you've played with before. It's a bit more experimental. Well, I guess the last two have been also, but this one definitely is more classically experimental and more visual. And in the handout in the last page, yeah, in the last page, I even if you are arts and craftsy, this is something I've been wanting to do with my kids. Actually, is doing this type of poem. Just so you know, as a bonus, I did one that was more of an arts and crafts piece. If that's something that you ever feel like doing for fun, I think it's on page 11 of the handout. So being able to do, going through the same steps with the same goals that we have for the rest of the poems today. But I just particularly wanted to point out the bonus activity this week because it's very different, where you can, you can really create a collage and cut and paste and, make something quite visual and beautiful. If you do look up, blackout or redacted poems, especially if you just Google image them, most of them come up as what feel like handmade objects, and I have some chapbooks that are like this, where you could tell obviously they have to be reproduced for the chapbook, but everyone was obviously originally handmade. It's really an art piece, and those are quite beautiful. Has anyone, has anyone done this type of poem before? There's a couple different formats we're going to look at, but has anyone ever tried either a blackout or a redacted poem before? Were you taking out words in different forms? Oh, Jean, you have? Yeah. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. And so we're going to look at a couple of different ways. And as I mentioned, is bringing some pages from a non-poetry literary work. We've done a lot with other people's poetry with the Cento, sessions. So I thought it would be better to bring in, something else. So in something that, as we see in these, it gives you a lot more language to work with, also a lot more flexibility. So the idea of having an entire page full of words it could be so much better than finding, say, a poem in this format, because blacking out words or whiting out words within a poem, especially if the poem has shorter or even mid lines, the visual won't quite be the same. There's something I think quite beautiful about having a prose page with 90% of it blocked out with just these very select words can be quite beautiful, I think. And hopefully we'll look at quite a few of those today. But so yeah, it just in a general sense, we're going to look at a few different kinds, but just the Erasure poetry in general. Sometimes I call blackout poetry, but there's some I'm not sure if you know, there's some wiggle room between some of the terminology. Not everything is a straight synonym, because Erasure poetry can be a couple different kinds of poetry, not just blackout poetry, but that's the classic. Or as we see on the page 1, whiteout poetry, which we saw more of. This Mary Ruffalo poem. I love the visual of the whiteout. Something so scholarly, I think, and more professional about the whiteout, kind of teacherly. But with this type of this type of found poetry, we're taking obviously an existing text and we're erasing or blacking out, or in other ways obscuring the vast majority of the text. And the goal of creating a poem from within a non-poetry text. And there's so many different ways of doing this. And I went through my bookshelf. I'm like all of you probably. I have a bunch of bookshelves downstairs. And I was looking through it and I was like, I want to be able to bring this book in. And I, for the life of it, was years ago I'd read it. For the life of me, I couldn't remember who the poet was. I couldn't find it to bring it in, but of an entire collection where they were taking some of the same pages from the same novel and creating wholly different poems with wholly different contexts, all from the same pages even. It was just, I love that. That's just such a beautiful idea to me. Karen, who's often part of the group, but had emailed saying she couldn't come today. Her center from this past week that she sent to me was actually from her own book. So she actually did it, her own center from her own work. And she thought it might be a fun project, which she just thought of last week, to do multiple ones using some of the same, lines that she had chosen, and just reordering them and with those slight tweaks, with the goal of having at least 3 poems using the exact same language, just tweaked a little bit. And so that kind of reminded me of that. The idea of, I love how we can repurpose things in so many different ways. You know, it's not just, oh, I've done this one project, I'm done. You can do it that way, but I love, and I'm very inspired by the idea of being able to create multiple totally different poems with totally different tones, different contexts, different ideas, different narratives, all from the same original pages. So this idea of recontextualization, I think, is pretty important in poetry anyway, right? Most of the time, if we're using imagery, it's standing in for some other kind of imagery, right? If there's a flower, maybe it means life or death. I know that's a classic, of course, but or, you know, if there's a sky and it could mean God, or it could mean this, or it could mean that, or horizon and someone on a horse walking out toward that horizon at the end of the old Western movie. The visuals, that idea of creating a context via metaphor. And here it's just so much more direct, you know, as opposed to being a metaphor. You literally just taking, you know, 7 centuries of sobbing gathered in the twilight. None of this has anything to do with the original text. With Mary's, for example, I actually found the pages of this original book, and the tone of these pages is nothing like the tone of the poem. She really is creating a whole new work here. And this can all is, I get the sense of collaboration from this kind of work. Being able to recycle something and make it anew, the idea of starting a dialogue between the original work and your own work. And the idea of, I think it's in some way, it depends on how you want to do it. Some people approach this as a way of honoring whether it's the tone or the context of the original piece, and others, the polar opposite. Maybe you've seen that with, say, Trump speeches back in 2016, that became quite popular. And you'd see it in, you know, the New Yorker and here, and then Vulture, all these places. Everyone was publishing, from generally big name poets, all these blackout poems, taking, for example, some of his speeches and just taking certain lines. And some of them, yes, they were taking some of the really ugly phrases and words to create their poem. But others were doing the opposite. So seeing a Trump speech where suddenly it sounds beautiful and positive, as if what he's saying, you know, making the poem the opposite of what he's saying. So I think there's just so much flexibility here, and a lot of experimentation. Not that there's ever any right and wrong, but here, since you're not weaving lines from various poets together, since you're not doing that, you could create 50 poems probably from the same 2-page spread, just depending on what you choose. So there's going to be a lot of flexibility, a lot of experimentation, I think. So the idea of being able to have the pages, and I know you can't do all this now, but in the future, like if I can photocopy them or something like that, or if you have them, you know, digitally, and so could just print them. When I've done these before, I've always had multiple copies of the page in front of me, not just one. And therefore I could experiment, and I ended up with a bunch of different versions. And naturally one was stronger than the others, and that was the one I would use to submit. But you can absolutely create a whole collage's worth of these, all from the same 2 pages. So with this, the first ones, yeah, we're going to be looking at are the blackout ones. So blackout, redacted poetry usually are generally considered the same thing. Using you'd pretty much taking this piece of text, as we see, let's say on page 1 here. Sometimes it's a work of fiction or nonfiction. in terms of literature. Sometimes it's a speech or a political document, or even a book or a magazine, or the William Shatner article. You could do it with the William Shatner article if you wanted to, Paul. So it could be really anything. And the idea of removing certain text, redacting it. And I love the fact that it ends up looking like some sort of political document that someone in the government has gone through and it's like, nope, the public is not allowed to read this. You're not allowed to read this. You're not allowed to read this. And this is what we are allowing you, which is very little. So there's something, but you're doing it for the sake of beauty as opposed to secrecy, right? You're trying to open the language up as opposed to closing it down and only giving the public a small taste. So I think it's so beautiful that it looks the same, but is doing the polar opposite of what the government sometimes, for example, does with these types of documents, or corporations. So with this first one, the first one with Mary Ruffles, she is one of the few people I've seen that actually uses white as opposed to black. But and personally, I think I almost prefer it in a way. There's something more delicate about it. So erasing most of the words from the existing text and then framing the result on the page. There's going to be a couple different structures we'll see later of ways of doing it. Some people, for example, which we'll see in a little bit, some people, they get rid of the rest of the page. They get rid of all the white out, all the black out, and they take the words and they leave them where they would be on the page, but they actually get rid of everything else. So you don't see the black, you don't see the white, you just see the words, which we'll see in a few pages. But most of them are what we see here, which is, sorry about that if you heard the kids, I apologize. So looking at this one, for example, the white, little white shadow on page 1 of the handout. And again, I apologize if you can hear the kiddos. They're unbelievably bouncy right now. Hopefully they get downstairs later. Is looking at this. So the majority of the time, if you've encountered these, you're not going to know anything about the original text necessarily. I think sometimes it can help if you do, if it is a book you're familiar with. I've seen very extensive work done with Bram Stoker's Dracula, for example, of going through, I think it was the entire book and turning the whole thing into a blackout poem, the entire 200 and some odd page novel. So sometimes it's nice to have that, because then you're like, oh wait, so the original text means this, and this is what you've done with it. But in most cases, if you're encountering it in a journal or something, you don't know the original text. So you're just left with this poem. But what we have here, see, we have tiny words, just like the, and then little or we have 7 centuries of, some longer phrases. You don't have to make it quite this, actually the next one's going to be even more so. You don't always have to make it quite this sparse. Some people do, leave a little more language, and some even less. I've seen ones where there's just 1 or 2 words on the page, quite experimental. But with this one, part of the reason I think maybe a common question would be, I'm sure the word the showed up quite often in the word and. They probably show up a lot in these pages. So why this particular, why that particular the, for example, on the second page of this spread? And my assumption being because you want the to be close to the word dead. You want them naturally that you're going to read it that way, but you kind of visually, I think a lot of it's the visual here. You want it to be visually paired with the word the. If the word the, with the word dead, if the word the was somewhere after through on that first page, it's so far disconnected from dead. So there is a visual component to this, apart from the obvious kind of interesting visual aspect of when you're selecting which words. Yes, you're trying to create a poem from it, but I think you're also trying to create a visual from it. You have to consider where you want your spacing to be. For example, you want the dead to be close together. You don't want the just hanging out there. But maybe it makes sense. Maybe it makes sense to have an and hanging out there, as if here's the beginning part of the poem, or here's the first image of the poem. A lot of black space, a lot of white space, and a lot of black space, a lot of white space, and then more of the poem. But sometimes a word like the, for example, you might want to try to pair it with the most important word that it's, that's being paired to visually on the page. So with hers, 7 centuries of sobbing gathered in the twilight, and had their pages wandered through the dead. borrow so little from the past, as if they were alive. So Mary Ruffalo has this whole series, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but oh, and that's okay, Shelley, you said you have a tough internet connection. Definitely understand that. Yeah, so I don't know, with this, it's in some ways hard to discuss. It's more to do with questions, I think, right? What are your thoughts on like what we're seeing here, and then the next one even more so, even the next one's a bit more political. What it's truncated, it's broken up, and this structure, it usually is, right? If you're familiar with this, it usually doesn't read as smoothly. I know like with Cento, we kind of had discussed the idea of either making little tweaks, which obviously we can't do here, or trying to do something, whether it's the ordering of the phrases and things like that, to try to smooth it over so it doesn't read awkwardly and kind of jerky, so it reads smoothly like one of your own poems would. Whereas here, there's less of an ability to do so, of course. So it's, since we can't add anything and we can't reorder anything. So the select, I think part of it is, it's going to be the biggest challenge, I think, even more so than the Cento, is trying to find your voice within this. How do you find your voice when you can't change the language and you can't order it in a different way? And not that there's a specific answer to that, but I think that's the thing that's always plagued me, if you want to call it plagued. It's a struggle, it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge. How do you make this? So 7 centuries of sobbing, just taking that, I think, is absolutely just gorgeous, and then framing it like that. So for me, when I've done these kinds of poems, just as a hint, because we'll be doing writing in just a little bit, for me, a lot of it has to do with that setup, right? There's so many words on the page, but once you have, if you can get a strong first phrase, in this case, 7 centuries of sobbing, if you can get that strong first phrase, that for me worked as the anchor or the guide for the rest of the piece. Having that set up, whether it's a brief phrase or two near each other that shows a setting or an emotional core, or in this case, something obviously more historical, something more cultural with 7 centuries of sobbing. But whatever it is, what you choose to begin with, I think, is going to be incredibly important. And I'm going to ask, I want questions, I want to see some thoughts on this, but just to kind of pair it, since it's so short, I wanted to pair it with the poem on page 2, which is a little bit different. This is the application for naturalization in the US. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And that's why I mentioned the idea of bringing 2 political documents, because this is definitely heavily rooted, not just in literature, but in culture and politics also. So the idea of starting, I think, with something, I don't want to say starting strong, that's subjective, but starting with something that's going to frame the rest of the language you choose. So here with Nina, she says, do you have awful associations? So starting, because it is a naturalization form, so therefore there's going to be questions. Starting with a question, having it be directly to us as readers, right? Do you have, and then choosing the word awful, just starting right off with, if you know this is a naturalization paperwork and you know that naturally our country, like almost every country, has fairly deep issues with with citizenry and immigration. So do you, inviting us into it, have awful associations? Have you been, I know it's really hard to read this one. I don't know, I should have brought up my screen so I can zero in on it. Have you been in total terror? And then a yes/no box. She kept one of the yes/no boxes. That is one of my favorite moves of any of these poems. She actually just left a yes/no box in there. It feels so unpoetic, but it also, I think there's something about this particular piece that more than most separates itself from traditional poetry and really enters into the idea of inviting a reader directly into the poem and saying, no, I'm asking these questions of you. This isn't a poem that I've created from this document. This is something for you, the reader. So maybe later with your the political documents, that might be something you may or may not be able to do with it, depending on the language. But I love that. I love that approach of getting the reader directly involved, asking the reader direct questions in the piece you're creating. if it works with the tone. If you enter, I lose it, yeah. And look, she cuts this word in half. I've never seen that in another one before, but she actually cuts a word in half so that, right, C-L-A-I-N, which is a really interesting move. It's a really creative move. It obviously makes it difficult to read in many ways, but these aren't necessarily meant for fluidity of reading. I think it really is a move of experimentation and recontextualization. So being able to, the idea of cutting that up, I can see doing that, especially if you want to have like an ing phrase at the end, or, oh, even better, if there's a word, for example, that has two parts to it, right? And then you have, if there was, hard-headed, but the word was hard something else, but then you see headed over there, maybe you'd block it out right there, so it'd be hard, and then over there you see headed or something, so that you can create the word from parts of other words. Not as common, but I think it works quite well. And then here, of course, the rest of it just really fragmenting it. To have country, no, you confirmed. To me, the idea that I think it speaks to the overall concept of the poem, having individual words so spread out. I think that speaks, at least to me, of perhaps the immigration experience, that idea of just being one tiny little, depending on who's interviewing you or who's having you fill out this paperwork, they may or may not even see you as a fully fledged human being, because a lot of people, especially Americans, don't. So the idea that each tiny little word, just like each tiny person, is just kind of drowned in this sea of paperwork, the sea of black. So I think the visual is as important as the words you choose in this form, which is counterintuitive to us poets, but the visual is as important. So that's something I definitely want everyone to be thinking a lot about. And that's why I find with this type of thing, you usually have to do multiple drafts, right? You keep playing with it until you get just the right matching of language and form in the visual. And I also, on page 3, I have kind of a breakdown of a way that I've found to do these, kind of a step-by-step. But I wanted to ask first, just looking at the poems on page 1 and page 2, quite different, I think, in many ways, especially in tone. Are there any questions or any thoughts on how these two might work, or especially questions yourself, right, about how you might do these? Because we're going to do some writing in a sec. Do you think you have a general idea, right, of looking at it, and you're going to be selecting individual words or phrases, trying to get them to create something that has a degree of fluidity, but knowing by its nature it is going to read more awkwardly than the cento from earlier? But then how do you take, especially with the political documents, how do you take the original context or political speech or historical document? I've seen it done with those too. How do you retain the original intent? And what are you doing with that intent? Does it become ironic? Is it true to life? Are you trying to create something more contemporary from something, from an older document? It's so hard to do. So each one of these I've done so many times, where I'll take, I'll have 5 or 10 different copies of the same pages and just keep trying out different things until something works, something makes sense, something clicks. And for me, a lot of it does, as I said, have to do with those first lines you choose. Or you could do it the other way too, of course, like looking at the bottom here on page 1, as if they were alive. I can imagine being like, ooh, look, this 2-page spread I chose, it ends with as if they were alive. That is inherent. That just obvious. I think pretty objectively is a pretty fantastic closing line to a certain kind of poem. So I can imagine starting at the end too. So a couple different ways of doing it, but I don't know. Are there any questions you think, or thoughts on any of those about how they might work? Everyone just wants to write. Is everyone really excited to write? Yee. All right. Well, let's do this then. So I want to review some, I want to review these steps that I've kind of come up with, which are on page 3. And I want to see kind of what your thoughts are here. So with the step 1, we have obviously you're gonna have to read it. So this is gonna take a while. So that's why partly I think most people are somewhat familiar with this form, so I didn't want to over talk it in terms of introduction. So I want to make sure there's plenty of writing time, because you're gonna have to look through it, whether it's scanning or reading it word by word, but going through it as we had before. Being on the lookout for, again, words or phrases that jump off the page. But here it's quite different, because here the context is going to matter, because what you create inherently has a direct relation to the original piece. So like Paul, for example, if you were taking, a line from Shakespeare and a line from, Wordsworth and this, you have all these people, you're not necessarily in any sort of direct conversation with them, right? You're honoring them, you're recontextualizing their work, but you're not directly, whereas in here, you're in direct conversation with the original piece. So it's a little bit different in terms of the kinds of language you might be selecting, because there's going to be more of an intent behind it, not just, that's a cool phrase, I'd like to put that in this kind of cento collage piece. There has to be more intent, I think, behind the language one chooses. So this idea of looking, I think, for an anchor, which is kind of what I meant when I was talking about either looking at the beginning or end, but looking for an anchor, a main idea, a subject. And that would be the first thing that I would look for, even more than the language, because you can find other language to support that main idea or subject. But first, what is that idea or subject? And it's something that you can hold on to, something that's going to provide the main thrust for the whole poem. And it could be in the middle of the pages that you selected. It could be anywhere. But finding that, I think that core is going to help decide what the rest of the poem is. You're going to want to relate the rest of the language to that core that you found. And you may already know the core. And again, I hate to just keep going back to this, but it was very popular a few years ago. If one has, for example, a Trump speech, you may already have in mind, I want to make something beautiful of this. I already have an intent. Whatever the language is on the page, I know what I want to say about this. Or, if you, obviously with the whole vampire lore coming from the idea of the plague, I mean, that's where it comes from, right? And fear of blood and diseases and pathogens from so many years ago. The idea of, okay, well, if I were to take some pages from Dracula, how can I find language to make it contemporary given the world we live in now? How different is it now? People are afraid of each other physically, to breathe on each other, to touch each other. People are afraid of that now. They were then. That's what this whole mythology is about, at its heart. So therefore, can I find something to make it more contemporary? Or you could try to make something ironic, or you could try to make something hard-hitting. So you may already know, when you take out your literary text, for example, in just a moment, you may already know what the tone is, or how you want to approach it. But what is that main idea or subject? So that's going to be the first thing that we're looking at. And then the rest can fall into place, I think, from there. And the rest is more experimentation. But I don't think the main idea is going to change much. When you're looking through it, you're like, this is the core. So the first thing we want to find is reading through it and finding the core. And then from there, the next step, and I'm going to stop, and after I read step 2, I'm going to ask everyone to take out the literary documents, not the political ones, but the literary ones. And I'd like to break this into steps, so it's not just, here's a bucket of writing time. We're gonna break it down. So we're going to do steps 1 and 2, at least for this kind of draft. We're going to do steps 1 and 2. Then we're going to look at Nets by Jen Bevins, which she has an entire collection of poems just like this. So we're going to look at that and see what she's doing with that. And then we'll do steps 3 and 4. So step 2 is what I was calling anchor. So having the main idea or the subject, then you can kind of scan the page for in step 1. Then you look through the pages to find precise language that's going to speak directly to that main idea. So you don't have to look for the little things. Don't look for the ands. If you want to put, a circle or underline a phrase that you're like, ooh, that sounds really nice. But really, at this point, it has more to do with whether it's circling, underlining, or just writing down at this point, if you don't want to write on your actual page, which I understand. Finding language that is going to directly relate to that main idea or your intent. And then from there, the next steps will be things like inventory. So going through and actually looking for language, looking for the language to fill up the rest of the poem. But for here, what we're going to be doing is scanning both pages, or I said at least 2. You can bring in more than 2, but I like the idea of having the dual pages. That's a fairly common thing here, is having 2 side-by-side pages to read as a poem. So if you have those, let's say 2 pages, looking through them, consider your intent, consider what tone you want to have, and look through the pages and look for what might be the main idea, the core of it. And then when you feel like you've done that, then really pouring through the language of the document, the say 2 pages, and you might need more than 2. That's why I said at least 2, but I think two's probably good enough, but it's okay if you need more. And then go through it, the language with more precise detail, looking for language that you can keep that will support the idea that you came up with. So again, if you're looking for a political, the storming the beaches, if we have something like that, and it's like, oh, maybe I want to turn this into a poem about peace or something, so, maybe, okay, that's my main idea. What specific language can I find to support that? And then, so what I'd like to do is go through steps 1 and 2. And then we'll return and look at a set of poems by Jen Bevins. And then we'll go through steps 3 and 4. And then we'll move into the more political aspect I mentioned. Does that make sense? So I'd like everyone to take out the literary text that you have. And I'm just going to bring up my phone here purely for the, get my timer going. Okay. So if you could bring out your literary text, and how you approach it is however you like. Personally, like when I've had things printed out, I don't know if any of you have it, I love these, the multicolored pens, remember from elementary school, where all the different, they have all the different ones. So sometimes I'd be like, oh, well, that just sounds like a really lovely phrase. I don't know if I'll use it or not. And then maybe I would circle it with a certain color. But where it's like, okay, this is stuff involving the main core of the poem. And maybe I would circle or underline that with a different color. Because you don't want to necessarily, if you see something, you're like, no, but John asked me to look for core ingredient. At this point, he's asking me to look for core ingredients, but my eye just caught something. I don't want to miss it on my next read. So that's why I've often used multicolored pens for this kind of thing. But for now, let's focus on this. And of course, if you see other stuff, feel free to mark it. Of course, you're like, oh, this might work. Feel free to mark it. But for now, main idea, main subject, consideration of tone and your intent, and then going through and looking for phrases, individual words, whatever it is, that seem directly related to what you're trying to do. So I know this is going to take a little while. So before I set the time, I want to ask, are there any questions? And this is just the first step. We'll go through the next 2 later. But okay. If not, then, so we're going to go for 15 minutes, and then, a minute or 2 before I'll let you know, to come back. And yep, we'll look at some more poems, then we'll do the next few steps, and then hopefully we'll have a loose draft. Because again, I've done 5 to 10, attempts before I get one that I feel is complete. But we'll do that first draft so you get the feel for it. All right, so all right. So if you want to turn your video off, you're more than welcome to. I'll set my clock right now. I'll see you in 15 minutes. Good luck. I'll be here, so if you pop anything in the chat, feel free to if a question arises. All right. Good luck. just so you know, there's about a minute left. So if we can begin to wrap up just this particular phase, and then we'll look at steps 3 and 4, and then do some more and some poems, and then we'll do some more writing. So just about a minute left. All right. So no rush, of course, but just as you begin to see where you are, and I'd love to find out where you are in this regard too. This is one of those really fun ones for me. This type of the experimentation and play here is a lot of fun, but it's also one where it's a little bit difficult to do in a workshop, I think, because a lot of times it's playing with things, and I'll just have background music, and I'm just playing with words here. And I have done this kind of thing in in-person workshops, and in that regard, I find them it to be easier, right? Because depending on the location, you very likely may have like a photocopy or something there. So I'd have everyone make tons of copies of things. I'd even have scissors, and people could cut out words and do all sorts of stuff like that. But obviously we can't do that in this scene and in this situation. And I didn't want to ask everyone, I don't want everyone to kill trees. You may have your own process for things. So I didn't want to require, bring in paper this, bring in 6 copies of this. I didn't want you to have to do that if you don't want to. So, but definitely that, I find that the best way to do it is to play around and just cut and paste and copy, and slowly things begin to make sense. And for me, once you find that main idea, that main theme, it becomes much easier. Could I ask, with what you brought in, could I ask, did anyone feel like maybe they have a sense of what that theme might be, or what that subject might be, based on what you found within the text? Not quite yet. Did you find some language though that might be paired together towards something? You just don't know what that thing is yet. So you're getting some language, but don't know what it's gonna center around. I don't know.
For me, it was just, I could take it in one direction but I'd have to erase some of the phrases that would take me in a different direction. So it was like I had to choose, and so then I was like trying to preserve both, and then I got, so yeah, I was stuck, I guess, because I wanted both.
You can have both. You can have your cake and you can eat it too here. You really can. And why? Because you can do two different versions of the same one. And I've seen that happen before, and you absolutely can. So if you're having two fairly distinct kind of cores, and yeah, you're like, oh no, but I really want to use this language, but I can't because it doesn't work with this core, it works with the other one, then you can do it twice with the exact same pages. And that's fantastic. It's a great experiment too. Well, can I ask what original text you brought in, if you don't mind me asking? The non-poetry text?
I actually cheated. So I brought in the
Goodness.
Blackout Poetry Journal.
Oh, how do you bring out blackout poetry to a blackout poetry? Oh my gosh. So wait, what were you doing then? How do you do that?
It's a pre-made thing. I bought it off Amazon, and it's just got a bunch of like open source texts, and they just chose a whole bunch of them. And so yeah, so it's page after page after page of random things, and so I just picked one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting book. Okay, when you first said that, I got nervous. I was like, how are you going to make a blackout poem from something that's already blacked out? You'll have like one word on each page.
No, it's a journal.
It's a journal in order to. That's a cool idea. I like that.
Yeah.
Nice. I'm not going to call anyone, but it sounds like maybe did anyone find what they think maybe is either a theme or a tone that's going to work again, whether it's being in direct conversation with, or taking a different turn on the original text? Do you begin to get a feel? Maybe after the next set of two things, maybe that'll come into play. This is the way that I had done it. I'm sure there's a million other ways of doing it. You could just go through and just start finding words, as opposed to starting with the goal of finding that core. Personally, I just found it easier to have the core, because then it was easier to spot language that would work with the core. Because otherwise it would just be like, especially if it's a piece of literature that you love, and it may well be, right? So if you chose it. So if I brought in 100 Years of Solitude, it's like, well, I don't want to black any of this out. It'd be hard until I find that core. And then it's like, oh, okay, wait a second. Okay, so I'm going to stick with this particular element of these pages, this particular element. Otherwise, what am I going to do? It's Crime and Punishment. It's all beautiful. So that's why I thought these steps made sense. But in the future, and especially like with the political pieces, you can do different steps, whatever works more organically for you. But this first go round, we'll do my steps. But I don't know. Were there any? Well, we can look at these next two then. These next poems. So I don't know, has anyone read this Nets by Jen Bevins? It was a pretty big book a few years ago. Where the entire thing, the entire collection, it is a pretty thick collection. Nets is entirely blackout poems created from Shakespeare sonnets. It's pretty interesting, pretty experimental, pretty intense in some ways. A number of things I wanted to point out, one of which is I love the idea of taking hundreds and hundreds of Shakespeare sonnets and doing this, each one, and creating a whole collection around it. There's a consistency and a coherency to that. But also, structurally, there are so many ways you do blackout poetry. It does not just have to be what we just saw. So here is something else. And again, there are other ways beyond this even to do it. But this is something we haven't seen yet before. And that is not whiting out, not blacking out, literally deleting. So this is very much a visual choice on your end. This looks more like a traditional poem. Maybe that appeals to you. It's the exact same steps. It's just actually an extra step. Naturally, Jen here would have had to have retyped all this, right? Since she's not literally blacking it out. She has to do the exact same process, but then do the next step of retyping out the language she chose to keep. But otherwise, it's the same concept, but it looks very, very different. I mean, I love all of these. Personally, I do like this one more. Maybe just because I don't want to say it feels more publishable, but it's a bit easier to read. It looks looks less inherently clunky, right? With just kind of white and black everywhere. That looks more artistic, which is beautiful. But also this idea of, if you're gonna if you're thinking of including something in a book, for example, I always have that in the back of my mind, when I'm writing a poem is, if it's a weird structure, is this gonna work with the other stuff I do? Looking at Jen Bevans's work, this would fit in a journal, like structurally speaking, visually speaking, it would fit in a journal, it would fit in a book filled with poems that are not like this at all. Whereas the others, it would look, I would argue, pretty odd if you have a poem of, say, traditional or free verse poems, and there's just one or two huge blackout poems, unless you did it for a structural reason, like maybe it introduced each section of a book or something like that. Otherwise, it's kind of odd, and a lot of places might not publish, especially digitally, might not publish those kind of more traditional blackout poems. It's hard as a journal editor myself. It's tough to be able to get that on a screen. You'd have to make a visual, an image, a JPEG of it. So this I find quite compelling. I really like this particular structure visually. And this, you still have the scattered words. So with hers, and this is just these numbers here, which are 98 to 150, 141. So those are, as you maybe would guess, some of the Shakespeare sonnet numbers. These are not in any particular order. These are just some that I really enjoyed. So I just put them here because naturally it goes from 1 all the way to, how much does he have? I feel like it's 500 and something, I think, total sonnets. So I just chose a few here so you can get a feel for it. I just began this with number 98. So you absent in everything, the deep vermilion figures, pattern of your shadow. A weed of small worth asked to be made, to be new made. That bright becoming of things in the very refuge, in the very, was it refuse or refuse? Hard to tell. Such strength, depends on the context. 1,000 tender leaves unsway the likeness. So this whole entire collection, I've found a lot of imagery, things like that, but a lot of this idea of unsway the likeness, or you absent in everything. I think you absent everything and this idea of one's likeness not being able to be swayed are really core concepts, this entire collection, which I've read more than once. It's a beautiful collection. So that idea that she was able to find something to go, this thread to go through all of the sonnets that she went through, the hundreds of pages poetry book, and finding that core of identity, that core of our belonging or lack thereof, that light that we add to everything and that we take away from everything. The masks we wear, there's a sense of disguise to a lot of things. So looking at this, visually, do any of you like the visual of this? I think it's clear, certainly, but it really depends. I think politically speaking, some of the others might make more sense. But yeah, I really like I love white space, so I like the white space on this. But the other reason I want to bring this in too is you can make multi-sectioned collections too, as I mentioned, like with centos. Or the other thing is how abstract this is. This feels more abstract, I think, right, than the others. The other, just beginning with 7 centuries of sobbing gathered in the twilight. It's beautiful, it's poetic, it's metaphorical, but it has more of a grounded feeling. This feels, right? This just feels like the pen is just touching the page with every word. Just the absent, this pattern of your shadow. It's very abstract. So if that is something you would like to lean into, whether you already enjoy this type of poetry, or if it's something you kind of want to experiment in, you can take something where Shakespeare's sonnets aren't overly abstract, right? There's usually a fairly clear, right, vision for each one. So the fact that you can make something this abstract from something that's usually quite clear, I thought was compelling also. So there's a few different ways that you can do this. Are there any thoughts or any preferences that you wanted to share? I'm not sure. Do you now that we've seen the kind of whiteout, blackout, or this other one where there's just a lot of white space, is there one that you think you prefer, that you would lean toward visually? I don't know.
So in this one, I mean, are we supposed to be reading the faded out Shakespeare and thinking of them together? I mean, you haven't discussed that, but that seems like what
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
invite.
Yeah, so it's very, very, very faded. So it has that appearance of white space in a way, right? Because it's very in the background. So that is a great tool. So how does one do that? Whether you want to or not, I guess it depends. What I like about it is, and I'm glad you mentioned, I can't believe I forgot to mention this. What I love is that bringing out or highlighting certain areas and leaving the rest way in the background. I love that it allows the reader to do either one. You know, that's a very unique thing. Usually it's one or the other, right? This is what I've chosen to show you, but this is what I've chosen. Actually, this connects to next week's also, this cross-out poetry. It's kind of like, you can read everything if you want to. This is what I've chosen to highlight. So you can read my poem outside of the context of the original, or you can read it within the context of the original. So I think that there's something really special about that. So I don't know, you can, but don't have to. Some of it, I've read the entire collection more than once. And the very first time I had read it in its entirety, and then, you know, some months or years or whatever it was later, I had read it just the highlighted parts. And I thought it was really beautiful and fluid how both of them, I think this is the kind of collection, and maybe this is the kind of poem where it requires more than one reading. Because I think as a reader, right, you want to read both. You want to see the new poem by itself, and you want to see it within the context of the original. So kind of, for me as a reader, drives me to want to read it again.
So you can almost see it as a haibun with a big block of text and then a little block at the end.
Yes. Absolutely. I could, yeah. Absolutely. I don't know. I think, yeah, it depends, I guess, yeah, it depends on you as a reader, but I think this type of poetry in particular, it requires multiple readings. Whereas if something is blacked out, you're only given very scant language. You read it, maybe you do, maybe you do not have some sort of knowledge or relationship with the original text. And especially if you don't, then it's just like, okay, well, that's an interesting, you know, there's something quite just, as much as I love this form, otherwise I wouldn't be doing it this week. There's something that in some regards could almost feel like experimentation for experimentation's sake, if that makes sense. There's a degree of that with the blackout poetry. With what we see here, with Jen's work, it really is such a more immediate and I think more investing approach of giving the option of having the context on the page, but highlighting your poem within it. I think that adds a whole nother layer to the conversation. So that's one of the many reasons I quite enjoy this. I have not seen this particular form apart from this book. I don't think I've seen it elsewhere. I cannot imagine why others haven't adopted it, as opposed to just blacking out. There's only so much you can do when you black it out. There's a lot you could do with this. Yeah. So maybe we'll lean into this one. Who knows? I definitely like this one. So I think for the next, sorry, for 15. Okay, so for the next 2 steps. So we've already started, of course. So the step 3, this is back to page 3 on the handout. The idea of inventory. So this is something I'm going to let you, given the time to, I want to make sure that I'm going to let you do it the way you want to do it, but here are the steps that I had followed. So after finding that main idea and looking specifically for language that might, or that I could associate with that. And I went through and you could circle, or, you know, you have a separate sheet of paper and just list whatever you'd like to pull out. Yeah, words. I should say, I took out a separate sheet of paper, and then after I had gone through and circled or highlighted language that I really enjoyed that might work with the poem, then I often would write them down on a separate sheet of paper, list out those words. Obviously, it has to be in the order you find them in the text, because you can't change that visually. I put all that on a separate sheet of paper. And that way I could read it, I could see how it read as a poem. It's so difficult, honestly, to read. I feel like we need that for me as a poet. I can't just, you know, circle language on a page that's already filled with language and clearly and coherently be able to read the poem I'm trying to create. So I won't make this a requirement. I find it much clearer. So what I had done, if this helps you at all, like for a visual, so I'd have like, let's just say a whole page here. No, I like it without lines. I can't write poems with line pages, the lines get in the way. So I just have a plain white sheet of paper. And like, you know, starting at the beginning, after I go through and do all the circling and things like that, then I would start writing them with white space in between, you know, a little bit of white space in between each word or phrase that I had circled. And then I would read through it and get this and get a better sense of it. And that would allow me to go back to the text. So we go back to the text and then find, okay, what other little words, what other phrases would add to that? I just find it very difficult to do it on the page. I think it's much easier to have a separate sheet with the language you chose on that sheet. That gives you a good sense of, okay, wait, no, this is a bit too abstract, or I haven't quite gotten to what I wanted it to be, or that's not the best ending. But again, tough to do on a cluttered page. So that's kind of what, that's the main point of all of that is how are you going to piece these together? Do they work? You also, if you actually do anything like that on the physical page, if you start to black out before you're totally done with it, then yeah, what if you want to change something, it's already gone. So this idea of nixing. So the idea of, sometimes I've done this a couple times, you certainly don't have to, but sometimes I was doing, and sometimes you'll see this with blackout poetry too, where you'll see like an arrow connecting language. Like if it's something more like Jen Bevans's, you know, maybe there'll be a word that's circled and an arrow that goes to the other one. So I've done that before too. So I'd have the page and I would like circle a word or something and put an arrow with the next word and things like that to create more of a collage visual aspect. Or you can eliminate portions of words, as I mentioned. So there's like an ed, ing, you know, or in something, or de something. You can trim those, right? So don't highlight them or black those parts out. So if you wanted to, instead of unread, you just want it to be read, you can black out the un. But a lot of times you don't really know that until you see the poem, for me, on a separate sheet of paper. And I was like, no, the poem is discussing the ability to read the sky, let's say. So read, perfect. Unread or unread, that's the opposite of my intent. So now I know to get rid of the UN. So a lot of times I was going through and looking, the final step for me is going through and looking through the language to see if there are little parts of words I should get rid of, or if maybe I was just missing an A or the or something to keep it smooth. That would be the final kind of polish. And then of course you go into it and black it out at the end. But so the idea of, let's just looking for more language, tweaking just slightly what needs to be tweaked in that regard, cutting little parts. Or as have we seen, actually we haven't really seen yet, but if you see, like if you could see a word and you have the first part of it and then you see another word with an ing later, and you keep the ing from over here, and actually I should do it the other way. This is reversed on the camera. You keep the ing from a different word over here, but you keep over here. You know, read, maybe it was read and then just ing over here. So you read it as reading. You might not want that to be too far apart from each other, because otherwise it would be kind of weird if there's all this space and then just an ing. But if maybe later in the line there's something that has ing and that's going to work for you, then you can do that. And those are things you don't really notice until that final stage. You're really going through and you're like, wait, the tense here isn't right, but I can use something later in the line or on the next line to help that. So I know there's only so much we can do today, but I'd like to take some time to go through these and play with them, and then we're going to look at a couple of political ones. Are there any thoughts? And again, if you end up finding something that works for you that's not these steps, that's fine. These are just some steps that I've attempted in the past, just as a guidance. So you can do a different thing if that works for you. So let's do the most that we can do. And let's see, we'll go to 4:30 my time. So I guess that's 12 minutes. I'll let you know when there's a minute or two left, and then we'll look at a few political ones. Let's see. Okay, so I'll start the time now. Feel free to pop any questions in the chat. And I know this is interesting, but I think instead of it being stressful, this is one of those where I think one could approach it as fun. It's fun, and if it doesn't work out, it's kind of okay, right? If you're writing a poem totally by, myself, I'm a poem and I'm a stanza in, and I totally lose track of where I am in it, or it's just, and then it's like, oh gosh, now I'm all stressed. Whereas here, it's just fun. It's like, all right, I'll start over. I don't need that word anymore. Or nope, that's not the right phrase. That's not the right context. It's not the right image. So it's so easy. You can just kind of keep playing. It's kind of fun. It's like collage work. So so just make sure to have fun with it. Don't stress it. All right, I'll see you in 11 minutes. So there's just about a minute left, just to let you know. All right. I know that's not enough time. This is one of those you can play with for hours. But whenever you're ready. So how is, now that you've had a little more time with it, how are you feeling at this point? Do you feel like something's beginning to come together? Now, this is something you can play with for hours, but is something beginning to come together a little bit, do you think, in terms of what language you might use or what the theme might be? Kinda, a little bit. And I know this is definitely it's a unique art. It's a unique form, but it's one that I definitely suggest if you're enjoying it to play with quite a bit more or in the time until we next speak. And obviously you can send one to me in for critique. This, even more than any other form, including a cento, is going to be the hardest to critique, of course. However, if you chose, say, for example, Jen Bevans's structure, then I would be able to see the original text too and be like, oh, I can see why you chose those lines. Otherwise, sometimes it's tough to know what to suggest if it's fully blacked out. But yeah, I would love to see, over the course of the week what you've done. And if you do, for sharing next week, it's something where I could, if desired, because it's such a visual form, I could turn on or allow everyone to share, and that way you could share your page, your screen too, if you want to share the page, so we can visually see it. Reading out loud is not the same experience here. For the next one is Erasure Poetry. So for this second one, it's similar to what we'd seen before with the blackout poetry, but here you're literally erasing the text, right? Literally erasing from what we'd seen before. So again, looks this from Tracy K. Smith, for example, on page 6. Very famous poet, yes, but look. So therefore, she does have some other kind of more traditional blackout poetry, but I wanted to bring this one in particular to show just, and the next ones too, just to see how. Look at all of these. I mean, they are still eraser poetries, but they very much just look like poems. So they end up becoming, I think, much easier to read. So sometimes we'll see it structured like this. This is something that I find interesting is with Tracy's, with the original text, she did not structure, so this is something that's interesting. She did not structure it the way that it is on the page that she took it from. So she took the language in the same order as you have to, but then she structured it on the page to look like the poem she wanted it to look like. So this isn't something you see as often, but I think that this even more so has so much more flexibility here. So you can make it look the way you want it to look on the page. You don't have to be forced to stick to what the original page looked like. So for those who prefer prose poetry, that this might be tough, but it might be a fun experiment if you prefer prose poetry or more narrative poetry, or you like what we see here with everything with the very kind of free verse, white space based one. Or if you prefer couplets, you could turn a document into couplets. So you can do that if you want to. You have that freedom. So with this one, with declaration, for example, he has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. Which doesn't that read like a poem that you came up with yourself? I mean, more than any others, it reads so fluidly, but this is all language directly in that order from another text. So this is something that we can do. She obviously chose a lot more language, this document being multiple pages, and then she whittled it down to this so it looks like a poem. So perhaps this is a structure that particularly speaks to you. And on the next page, very similarly, she had Mary Spitz. I've met her before. We've chatted once or twice in person, and I always forget how to pronounce her last name. I feel embarrassed. I think is it Spitz? I don't know. She's such a fantastic person and poet. But with this one, the Annunciation under Erasure. And he came to her and said, the Lord is troubled in mind. Be afraid, Mary. The Holy will overshadow you. Therefore, be nothing. Be impossible. And Mary said, and the angel departed from her. Doesn't that sound like it's coming directly from the Bible in a way? And it's quite something. Something here that I wanted to point out that's a similarity between these two is not finishing a statement. It's something we can do in poetry anyway, but especially with this kind of form, I think it's really interesting, right? There's something incomplete about the vast majority of statements. So both of these do this where it's, ravaged our, taken away our, and then you don't give us the rest of that line. That becomes I think, an interactive experience with the reader, right? As a reader, you're plugging, there are various words or phrases you could plug in, whether it's ravaging your lives or your this or your culture or your country, or there's so many things you can plug in there. And I think similar, and Mary said, and then not saying what she said, that allows the reader to enter the poem and make their own decisions about what that could mean and what could be said there. So that, and also be nothing, be impossible, and Mary, and the angel, and he came to. So the idea that maybe you could find a structure using repetition. If you're seeing those same words, it could be and or be or the or anything but. Or in with Tracy's, he did this, he, and then ending things with our. So being able to use repetition and incompleteness. That's the thing I love most about these two is the incompleteness. So you can adopt incompleteness as a mantra for these. I want my lines to be incomplete. I want the reader to fill them in themselves. And that's something that really you can cherish about this form, as opposed to kind of be worried about it maybe in your own poem. Timing wise, let's not go through this next one purely for the sake of timing, but on pages 8 and 9, this is another, and it's an entire collection. The Ms. of My Kin by Janet Holmes. So this entire collection are selected poems by Emily Dickinson and turned them into Erasure poems. So this is something you can certainly read on your own. I also, on the next page, on page 10, have links to 3 other poems, or 3 other sets of poems. Some of them are inaugural speeches, yeah, and Trump translations, things like that, to get kind of more into the kind of political or cultural spirit. So you can certainly follow those links on page 10 too, if you like. So those are a bunch of poems you can read. Yeah, so I'd like, for the remaining time, having looked at those poems, is to take out the text that you selected that is not literary. So whether it's an article, I kind of left it up to you, but whether it's a political document, historical document, something like that. So, and again, I got that idea from, the idea of having the Declaration of Independence, or a political speech or something like that, and being able to play with that and create new meaning from that, recontextualize that. So I'd like you to take out one of the documents that you would come up with, and I'm going to let you choose the steps now that you've kind of gone through some of the steps that I had suggested before, or that I've used. I'll let you do it however you want to do it. Maybe you're getting a feel, maybe at this point, for now that you've seen visually how there are at least 4 different ways that it could look on the page, and that you can actually play with the structure yourself. That freedom may give you more options. If you're like, oh, I don't just have to say, oh, this, you can take things and put them together into your own poem. So knowing that, hopefully that gives you more leeway. So part of the reason I want to bring in 2 political documents is, you'll at most go through one today, but is that if you have 2, I love the idea of potentially, if it works for what you end up creating, of using 2 different documents. If you had that natural immigration form, and you had the Declaration of Independence, or or some great historical document, and then something more contemporary, and being able to turn both of them into a single poem or a multi-section poem. So that's why I thought it'd be cool to have more than one. But we'll start with one, and I'll let you do whatever process makes the most sense for you. We have, let's see, yeah, well, about 13 minutes. So you'll take out one of those and do whatever you like to do with it. And again, especially with these types of documents, you probably are going to have a sense of what you want it to feel like before you even start, probably. If you have the Gettysburg Address, you probably already have in your mind what you want that to say, whether you want to connect it to the present day and a current issue, for example, whether you want to twist it, because obviously everyone at this point knows that Lincoln wasn't a black and white situation, shall we say, with his approach to slavery and people of color. Wasn't black and white. So the idea of going through something like that and selecting language that would show the opposite of what we traditionally look at him as. So many things you could do, or you could just stick with something that just tries to make it beautiful, tries to make something that's not beautiful beautiful. But we're going to go for, I think about 12 or 13 minutes, and let's play with this document, and then hopefully with the goal, and then we'll just kind of stop by at the end to say goodbye, and hopefully at the end you'll have some practice, but also a decent amount of notes or a decent number of things circled to attempt 2 different ones. And you're welcome to share both of them with me over the course of the week if you'd like to, because these often end up being shorter in terms of line length and things like that. So if you end up with more than one, you're welcome to share both of them with me, and I'll let you share them visually on the screen if you'd like to next week. So, all right, good luck. I'll set my alarm. I'll see y'all in 12 or 13 minutes. All right, good luck. All right, I guess it's about that time. Totally up to you if you want to turn your cameras back on. You can, but you don't have to, especially because if you're in the middle of doing it, just because we're leaving doesn't mean you have to stay. So if you're still working, just keep working. Pretend like I didn't interrupt you. So next week will be cross out poetry, which is very different, and some of it's going to involve you bringing some of your own poems as opposed to other people's work. So next week's going to be different. Not totally found poetry necessarily, but there are similar things going on with it. The idea of pulling some things out of an original text while leaving others, which creates, highlighting certain elements kind of thing. So it's similar, but different than found poetry in that you're going to be using your own work, your own poems. You can write a new one also, and then crossing out things to highlight the importance of what's. Sometimes there's a lot of power with what's being. There's a lot of power of what you choose not to say, I think, in a poem, right? So the idea of actually showing via a cross out, showing what you're choosing not to say says as much, if not more, than what you do choose to say. So that's something I'm looking forward to. I have quite a few of those cross out poems myself. I absolutely love them. So we'll chat about those next week. So feel free to send me one or two of these poems that you do. I'll do my best to critique them. If not, I'll at least look at them. If I don't have the original source in particular, it's hard to make suggestions. But I would absolutely love to read them. I certainly look forward to seeing everyone next week. Are there any final? I know this might be the hardest one to do, but hopefully the funnest. You can even. When I do this, I always have just music playing in the background, and then I can just do this for hours. Especially before I had kids, I could just spend all Saturday just playing with language, playing with all the different pages and creating poems. So hopefully this is more of a fun exercise than a strict one. I'll be stricter next week. But yeah, if any questions arise, just feel free to shoot me an email if anything comes up. And be safe. I think my family's we're getting to COVID free now, so hopefully we'll all be better here. I haven't left the house in so many days. It'll be fun. So enjoy yourselves and remember to be safe. Things are getting better in most parts of the country, but that does not mean that they're totally good yet. But so be safe and continue to love each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.